We just talked about purification of water, and that clean drinking water is one of the most important priorities that communities need. The other one that we need is a reliable source for electricity. Now, in the last 200 or so years, we've relied heavily on fossil fuels, but we can see that that's not at all a sustainable way to go. Because, first, it's not at all a renewable source, and we also know that it's causing significant climate change that endangers everybody's lives on this planet. So, one of the viable energy sources that I want to talk about anyway is nuclear power. This tends to be a pretty controversial power source, but there's a lot of misconceptions about it. And the reasons why there's misconceptions about it is due to some really dramatic, tragic events that happened mostly during the 20th century. But it's not an energy source that we should discount as we look at our options for divesting from fossil fuels. So let's actually take a minute to address some of the issues, and I'm going to present you with some additional information that maybe will change your mind about what some of these problems are. So let's address the problems. The main problems that most people talk about when they talk about nuclear power and they have concerns about it is the waste. So what do we do with the nuclear waste, and doesn't nuclear power make a ton of waste? So that's one of our questions. A second question is that they're dangerous. Our second concern. So, what about all those nuclear meltdowns? Aren't they, super dangerous just in general? And doesn't the radiation just like living next to a nuclear reactor, isn't it producing a lot of radiation? And wouldn't that be dangerous to us? So let's go ahead and talk about them in order. It is absolutely true that the United States has a significant amount of radioactive waste that is sitting around and that is problematic. So radioactive waste is problematic for several reasons. So let's talk about those. So radioactive waste it produces ionizing radiation. And there's three different kinds of radiation. So there's alpha. And alpha radiation is relatively low energy. It can be stopped by your skin, by a piece of paper. So unless you inhale something that's producing alpha radiation or you eat it, it's not significantly dangerous to you. So beta radiation is the next most penetrating kind. These are electrons. Oh, and by the way, alpha radiation, these are helium nuclei. So it's like an He charged up because it lost its electrons. Beta particles are electrons that are being emitted from the nucleus of an atom. And these also, these are fairly penetrating. So these can penetrate the body, but it's pretty easy to shield against them. So even something like a piece of wood or a sheet of aluminum doesn't take a whole lot of shielding to do this. The other kind of radiation is gamma, and this is like a high energy X-ray. So this definitely can penetrate, and this is where you need that lead-lined box or something equivalent. A lot of concrete and lead, these will shield against the gamma radiation. So we do have ionizing radiation that gets produced, but we also have some that are corrosive. So mostly they are strongly basic, or they could be strongly acidic. And this is the real problem, right? Because if you have something that's just sort of sitting there like a rock and it's producing ionizing radiation, you can put it away in a concrete vault and it's just going to sit there. And it'll make the concrete radioactive eventually, but you can just leave it there. The corrosive stuff is the problem because this is the stuff that's going to eat through the container that's holding it potentially. This is happening in a lot of the containers over at Hanford in Richland, Washington. And they have eaten through some of the storage containers. Don't worry, they're working on reprocessing those, and they're taking the environmental radiation or remediation very seriously. There's a lot of great research that's going on in terms of stabilizing even these corrosive materials. So why do we have these? We have these because of bombs. The reason why the United States has a problem with radioactive waste right now is because of bombs, because we put a lot of energy during the 20th century to making plutonium. Now, plutonium is produced in a nuclear reactor, but it's a really, really small component of the product inside. And so you have to do all this chemical processing to your fuel rods and extract the plutonium from it and then condense it in order to make the bombs. Now, we aren't doing this anymore. We've stopped trying to produce plutonium. And so the vast majority of the waste that is sitting around here is from the bomb industry. And we aren't doing that anymore. So you want to know how much waste we're making right now. I just looked it up. And in the US makes about 2,000 metric tons of waste per year from its nuclear reactors. So this sounds like a lot, right? That's about 4,000 tons. This sounds like a huge amount of energy or a huge amount of waste. So let's look at the coal-powered plants instead. In the US, in 2018, we made an estimated 111 million tons of coal ash. Not to mention how much carbon dioxide did we make out of that? We don't even know, right? We could calculate it, but whatever. 111 million tons of coal ash from coal-powered plants compared to 4,000 tons. Yeah, 4,000 tons is a lot, but 111 million tons, let's just kind of right? That's 1,000, that's a million. So these are the two numbers we are comparing. And this is just from the coal-powered plants, okay? That's not talking about the natural gas plants or any oil stuff, not to mention oil spills, anything else, right? We're just talking waste and waste. Waste for the nuclear power plants in 1 year in the US, waste for the coal plants in the US. So if we're just comparing volumes of how much waste we're making, it's pretty clear that the nuclear power plants make a lot less waste in comparison to each other. Even though we have to take those 4,000 tons and put them somewhere and keep them safe, we actually even have some better sources than that. If we can do a breeder reactor, this is a very specific kind of reactor where you reuse the fuel. So you reprocess the fuel and use it again. So you get multiple cycles out of this fuel. This is a really super cool process. So this doesn't sound like you should be able to do it, right? That energy-wise, you shouldn't be able to do it, but it really does work. So what you do is you are using the uranium, and we'll get more into the details here, but you end up converting the uranium into thorium. And so the uranium can get used as a fuel, and then the thorium can get used as a fuel again. And both of these make really good nuclear reactor fuels. So this is how that whole process works. So efficiency-wise, we have some really great options. All right, so that addresses some of our waste issues. We're really not making very much waste, and we're still making a lot of waste using the other power electricity sources. Not to mention the fact that nuclear power is carbon neutral, and all of our petroleum sources are making tons and tons of carbon dioxide, like billions of tons of carbon dioxide each year. All right, so that hopefully convinces you that the waste is not an insurmountable problem, and that in fact it's much less of a problem if we consider all of the other ramifications of the waste that's coming out of our carbon-based fuels. So our second issue was safety, and this is sort of the bigger safety picture, right? We were going to talk about radiation just from living next to a power plant, right? Even if nothing is going wrong. So let's talk about safety and disasters. Yes, there are some really dramatic examples of safety accidents that have happened at nuclear power plants mostly in the 20th century, a couple of them in the 21st century. These are mainly due to either negligence or design flaws. If you look at the history of the disasters, you see that a lot of I don't even want to call them disasters, we'll call them accidents. So a lot of the accidents that happened early on were because of design flaws. Sometimes they were due to both. So like the Chernobyl disaster, which was a disaster, still kind of is a disaster. Chernobyl is a really great example of both of these. I don't have time to go into this, and lots of people have looked at Chernobyl in much more detail, but it's very clear that there was negligence that went into the disaster to begin with, as well as some very significant design flaws that have now been fixed in more modern reactors. So another one that people tend to bring up. So they bring up Chernobyl, they bring up the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown after the tsunami. And so with Fukushima Daiichi, there was mostly negligence that was going on here. So with this power plant, it had not received the maintenance that it was supposed to have received, and the seawall had not been maintained and built up to a high enough level to withstand tsunami-size waves. And given its location in near the coast, this was something that was supposed to have been done. So, I don't want to throw out all of this incredible technology just because maybe somebody isn't doing the job they're supposed to be doing, right? Instead, we need robust regulations, we need robust training, and we need monetary support to make sure that all of our power plants are up to code. And this is true for any industry, right? We wouldn't want somebody to have an explosion at a natural gas facility either because they had corroded pipes. And that's something that could happen perfectly easily. So let's actually take a quick look at Wikipedia. If I have any folks who are social scientists who are, or any other field who are watching this video, I know you don't like people to reference Wikipedia, but in most science areas, there's actually a lot of solid content in Wikipedia, and I like to use it as a starting place for finding information. So this is a good example of kind of a summary of lots of different events that have taken place. And what I like to do is go down here to the summary of all of the different accidents and incidents, because they have a detail about what happened and also how many people died. And so if you look, we're starting in 1957. And then it kind of goes down from there. So our first couple, we had some no immediate fatalities, but mostly these are releases of radiation. And as you get time going on, more and more knowledge was known at that point, to indicate that releases of radiation were problematic, but early on we didn't have a very clear sense for what radiation toxicity and long-term effects were like. So there were some poor choices that were made in terms of science ethics, especially early on. But a lot of these are accidents. So let's scroll down to, let's take a look, right? So here, keep your eye on this column. Look at the numbers. They're all pretty small. We have no idea how many people actually have gotten cancer because of Chernobyl, but this is the high one, right? 4,000-ish, maybe more. But most of these have zero. So there might be some releases of radiation into the air, or some minor failures, or sometimes larger failures, but most of these are pretty small. And even right here, the Fukushima Daiichi, there was a relatively small number of people who were injured or were killed in this incident. That doesn't minimize the harm that was done. It doesn't, say, oh, well, this is acceptable. But what I'm trying to do here is to contrast. So how many did we get up to? We got up to a total of about, let's call it 5,000, okay? Because we had 4,000-ish from Chernobyl, and then mostly kind of a few, plus these 500-ish, 440. Okay? So we're calling it 5,000-ish total people who have died in nuclear plant accidents. What this doesn't include, of course, is uses of nuclear bombs and nuclear bomb testing. But I'm not going to include those here because what we're talking about is nuclear power plants. And we're talking specifically about the safety of nuclear power plants. And so bombs have to be considered separately. They can't be included in our conversation right here. That doesn't erase them. It just means this is not part of our conversation. So let's talk in comparison now. We were talking about coal. Let's come back to coal. How many people do you think die each year from mining accidents or coal power plants or anything like that? Let's take a look at some data. Okay, so this is specifically only from coal mining. So this isn't talking about all of the health effects from coal, all of the air pollution impacts. This is only the miners, all right? So you can look over time. We've got a pretty high number of miners at the start of the 20th century, but let's zoom down and we'll go actually to 1957, right? That was the first power plant accident. Maybe we should go down a little bit past that. So it wasn't until 1945 when we even had any kind of sense for anything involving nuclear, anything at all, right? 1945 is when we figured out how to capture fission and use it to, make bombs at that point. But so if we look at this, we had about 1,000 miners dying each year until about 1949, when it dipped below 1,000 and stayed below 1,000. I mean, here we're really close in 1948. Per year. So between 1945 and 1950, you already have 5,000 miners dying to support the coal industry. Now, it wasn't until here, right, at 1985 when we dip below 100 per year, and it stays below 100 per year, but we also have a huge decrease in the number of people who are actually being miners. And so I haven't spent time to do what percentage of miners are dying here, but you can see that if we look at the number of people who died at power plants or because of power plant energy releases, that was about 5,000 total. That included our pretty dramatic accident at Chernobyl, which is the vast majority of that. Now you have, 5,000 in just a few years. And this is just for our coal miners. So I don't think that we really need to be as concerned about the safety of the actual power plants compared to the safety of other industries. This doesn't even include things like oil rigs exploding and stuff. This is only coal miners. And I'm making this comparison because it's so dramatic, but also because it's important to remember that our carbon-based industry is not cruelty-free, right? Besides for the fact that we're concerned about climate change, a lot of people die because of air pollution. A lot of people die directly who happen to be working, as miners, as people working on oil rigs, as people moving in trucks, all of these products around. So there's a lot that goes into it that we still need to keep in mind. We can't just pretend like that stuff doesn't exist. Okay, so I think I've harped enough on that. Let's move on to our third topic. And maybe I should just close by saying that the United States does have very rigorous training, rigorous testing, and rigorous maintenance and safety code requirements for nuclear reactors. And so I feel very confident that anybody who's working in a nuclear reactor, there's a lot of effort that goes into safety because we are so gun shy when it comes to nuclear anything. So I feel confident that we can safely run nuclear reactors. All right, so let's think about living with a nuclear reactor. Nobody wants one in their backyard, right? Because it would be dangerous. Well, it probably wouldn't. If we look at how often or what your radiation doses are like, there's some really great visuals that you can find on the web. Let's go take a look at one. This is from the EPA website, and they have a set of different possible common experiences. I don't know why they actually don't include airplane travel as one of these, but I'll come to that number in a little bit. So let's take a look. We have up here a whole body CT. So this is a medical scan. Radon is a radioactive gas that is very common in homes. And so in a year, you might get as much as 228 millirems. Radon is most common around places where you have a lot of granite. So it just depends on where you live on whether you have that. If you have x-rays, any x-ray that you get is going to give you a decent sized radiation dose. Living in a high altitude area, you get more of a radiation dose. So this is about where we are per year, 30 millirems. This is just from the ground. Living near a nuclear power station adds less than 1 millirem to your annual dose. You get more when you go get an x-ray. And this is inside your body, so we have small quantities of radioactive isotopes that are present in our bodies, like carbon. And so we get a small amount of it every year just from our bodies being there. If you look up what you get from a dose from flying in an airplane, you get about 3.5 millirem. That's down here right below the x-ray, a chest x-ray. You get about 3.5 millirem for a domestic flight, and so it also really depends on how long your flight is. So that's probably an average of 3 or 4 hours. So for most people, the vast majority of the radiation that they will receive is from naturally occurring radon gas that's in their environment. And you're also getting some just from living out, in the air. You get it from the sun. You get it from the ground. You get it from your own body. A lot more than living near a nuclear power station. So unless there is an accident, and even if there is an accident, the odds of having a significantly problematic amount of dosage is very low. And given the safety requirements for nuclear power plants now, I think you are pretty darn safe. You're probably more likely to get in a car accident and get hurt that way. So as long as our nuclear reactors, coming back to our 3 issues, right? As long as our nuclear reactors are well maintained and regulated for safety, then nuclear energy is an extremely safe and carbon neutral long-term energy source. So I hope that I've convinced you that this is something that we should continue to work with, continue to improve, continue to make more efficient, and move away from the disasters of the 20th century and into a much more confident period where we can see it as a reliable and safe source. In our next video, we'll talk about how this works and where we get the energy from.